Hello, and welcome to Need to Know, your weekly investment podcast brought to you by the experts at Coutts. I'm Sarah Muir, and I'm joined by Coutts multi-asset strategist David Broomfield. Hi, David. Now you were on a couple of weeks ago talking about China, and did you get a bit of fan mail after that?
Hi, Sarah. Afternoon, everybody. I did get fan mail. It's great to have a fan base. You wouldn't believe how many people out there have an interest in long-term growth projections for the BRICS. But no, I did get fan mail. It was lovely to receive. So I saw it pop up on my Outlook when I was in the middle of a Zoom call. So excited. I shut down the Zoom call, went to my inbox, and the fan mail started so positively.
Yeah.
And then I only soured by halfway through. I realized someone was trying to sell me something.
There's always a catch.
Anyway, look, just to be clear to all the listeners, this is not a call to action. I don't want to have my inbox flooded with fan mail. But
Okay.
of course, we do value your comments and suggestions. So if they're
Definitely
genuine and don't come with a price tag, then send them in.
Just don't try and sell us stuff. Anyway, off the subject of China, because that was kind of a starting point for the topic you wanted to cover this week. So what is it we need to know this week, David?
I think there's three things we need to know. So the first one, let's explore that long-term demographic story that we started a little bit when we talked about China and India. Let's talk about the world and what the shape of things to come might be. Yeah. Then let's talk about what implications that has and are having today on the healthcare industry and on Meditech. And then I think this is much covered in the press since late last year, but I really think we should explore it because there's some real huge implications to one particular drug and a whole family of drugs aimed at lifestyle illnesses. I want to talk about Ozempic.
Okay, good. All right then. Let's start off then with this population mega trend, and it was obviously sparked off the back of we were talking about China and India. So thoughts on what you're seeing there? Then what's the research telling us about this long-term trend?
Yeah, and let's just talk a bit about population statistics before we start talking about the answers to that question. There aren't many things out there that are predictable with a high degree of certainty, but demographic trends tends to be one of them, right? And it's very intuitive. If a country's having lots of children today, we know with a high degree of certainty, bar some disaster or exogenous shock, as economists would call it, that in 18 years' time, there's going to be a matching increase in the size of that country's working age population. Yeah. Okay, so that's your sort of starting premise. And you're right, we talked a lot about China and India. Let's just, to the 26th of March today, let's say China's the largest country in the world with 1.42 billion people. India a close second with about 1.41. But this is now what the trend tells you. If you look at demographic projections, by 2050, 1 in 4 of the world's population and 1 in 3 of its working age population are going to be from Africa alone.
Wow.
Wow, indeed. I mean, it's going to be a hugely different world. And I think I myself and many people listening here have grown up in a world where it was about an ascendant emerging Asia, and that's a pseudonym for China. And it was that story which was deemed to drive the growth narrative of the first half of the 21st century. It was about those two economies emerging. Fast forward to 2050, the Need to Know podcast, hopefully it's still running then. Someone will be talking about Africa and particularly about countries like Nigeria being the 3rd largest country in the world.
That's incredible. Because I noticed there was a piece of research that came out from the Lancet, and it's been quoted in the FT. And they're saying, quoting, obviously 2050 is the year that people are looking at. And they're saying that by 2050, 76% of nations will fall below population replacement birth rate. And the only regions that will be maintaining that birth rate will be sub-Saharan Africa and some countries in Asia as well. So does that mean we're then going to get, let's say, the Chinese and Indian economies continue to grow? Does that mean we're going to get mass migration from Africa to China and India?
Right. let's start with economic growth, because I think when we will get on to migration, because I think that has particular relevance for Europe actually. So economic growth. So first of all, going back to our principles, remember economic growth. I think I said this again on the China and India podcast, that economic growth is quite simply the contribution of capital, labor, and this thing called total factor productivity growth. So capital, remember, that's pretty self-explanatory. That's buying new machinery and new technology that allows economic output to be expanded. But the population element, clearly demographics is really key to that. So, if you've got a very young, dynamic working age population, and these economies in Africa are going to have that in 2050. Look at the stats today. Okay, look at the median age population in China. It's 38. The median age population in India, 28. In Nigeria, the median age population is 18. Right. Wow. So you've got this huge population of children that are going to become working age, and when they're working age, ostensibly there'll be a big contribution to economic growth from that labor force. But that doesn't happen in isolation. You're right. Let's get onto your migration question. You've got, in the northern latitudes, a giant European population that is much older. And, I said there's some quite difficult questions we all need to answer about immigration and immigration policy, and how will healthcare provision, as an example, be provided to that huge European old age population? Well, one answer, not the only answer, one answer is through migration, through younger people emigrating from Africa to Europe. Yes, it could happen to India and China. It's more complicated due to local policies and less freedom of movement, but in necessity could deliver that. So I think the world, going back to this big picture point, the world in 2050 looks radically different, and the implications for the West, the implications for the origins of global growth are huge.
So we're saying then what you're focusing on more then is the fact that we're going to see a shift in sort of these emerging markets. We're going to see this more perhaps dynamic economic growth happening in these countries that have got this burgeoning population boom.
Yeah, I think so. And you can look at this through a lot of different development economic lenses, but you can see factors of production, as they have shifted from China, which is now a relatively it's not a high cost economy to employ people, but it's a lot higher than what it was during the late 90s and the early noughties, when you had that big cheap labor force driving economic growth. You can see the factors of production have shifted from China already to other economies, moved out to Vietnam and Bangladesh. You could see them move again into some of these nations that we've just been talking about in Africa. I mean, that is one possible growth pathway. There's a lot of uncertainty. As I said right at the beginning, the thing we can predict with a high degree of certainty is what the population looks like. Predicting the growth story and those nuances of how global trade works and where the factors of production are located, the impact of technology on all those factors of production, a little bit more uncertain.
Okay. All right. Well, building on that then, so in 25 years' time, we're saying the current labour force is actually going to be old, and that's obviously going to impact productivity. What is it you're seeing then, or what is it you think might impact that? This brings on to our second point, doesn't it?
Yeah. So what's the picture in 2050? Okay. Well, the picture is a huge old age population across the Western world. And we know that those aging populations are generally accompanied by a higher prevalence of chronic diseases, lifestyle-related illnesses, and all of those factors that we read about in the press, obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, things like that. And meanwhile, that large population needs to be supported, that large aged population needs to be supported by a much smaller workforce. We talked about immigration perhaps being the answer to that. Who knows? Perhaps robots and AI are the answer to providing healthcare to all of us in our old age. I don't know. But what we know today is that pharmaceutical companies and the healthcare companies in particular are not only anticipating that future demographic makeup, they're responding today to lifestyle related illnesses that are only increasing. And I think my second point is about how healthcare companies are responding to an aging population with a higher prevalence of lifestyle illnesses in the West. And I did some digging, looking at some stats here. I mean, the numbers vary, but just to give everyone an idea of scale, the global healthcare industry is somewhere between an $8 and $10 trillion industry. Right. It is enormous today. And if you look at how expenditure has been increasing, and I've got a view here that the pandemic changed a lot of things, and by that's a truism. It accelerated a lot of things. Like for instance, our working from home was already on that pathway. We were always going to probably work in a hybrid environment. The pandemic catapulted us into that environment. Similarly with healthcare, the amount of money that has been now spent on Meditech and focused on drug research into lifestyle illnesses. If you look at the charts, you see this marked change post 2020.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, if you look at where that expenditure is going, I did some digging looking at the top 5 major pharmaceutical companies, AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, Novartis, Roche and Merck. You get a number of around 80 to 100 billion a year spent on researching drugs for non-communicable diseases. So that's code for lifestyle-related illness.
Yeah.
Okay, so today you're seeing all these healthcare companies plow billions, hundreds of billions as a group into researching that for those diseases to try and mitigate these effects of aging populations and our lifestyle, and also, you know, keeping us on trend, AI. There's a huge volume of research, of investment into AI. Some quite big public announcements by companies like Microsoft getting involved. Google's working with Bayer, IBM's working with Microsoft Azure to try and develop diagnostic models driven by AI. So, you know, it's such a fast-growing area of interest for investors, and it all goes back to these points on demographics.
So are we saying then that developments in Meditech and healthcare are going to a certain extent, mitigate those changes in demographics that we're seeing in developed economies?
Well, this is the big question, isn't it? And I think it will to an extent. That's my view. I mean, you can't escape the trend that we're all getting old. I would love to believe that pharmaceutical companies have got a solution. Yeah, let's be optimistic. We don't have a solution for that problem today, but we do have a solution. Well, we have many solutions coming down the R&D pathway aimed at some of the diseases that affect our labor forces and our working age populations. So if you know, just to be clear, if we say due to life expectancy and other pressures that the retirement age, the average retirement age is just going to continually be pushed out, it will mitigate some of the sort of lifestyle and old age related illnesses and problems that we have today with some of this R&D and all this investment into Meditech that we're starting to see. So I think it's not the solution to the demographic trend, but it could materially alter the productivity, the quality, and the longevity of labor forces. So those demographic trends that were very predictable are still predictable, but the nuance here is that the quality and the size of the working age population probably isn't going to be like it is today. It's probably going to be pushed out to an older age, and the quality of the labor force could if you believe in the ability of meditech to solve some of these problems and biotech and pharma, then that could be a significant material improvement.
Are we suggesting then that the changes in productivity brought about by meditech could rival what people said about the internet when it was launched, or people are saying about AI now?
Yeah, it's very interesting, this question, because I'm not cynical. I'm skeptical when it comes to the immediate productivity pop you'll get from technology. I mean, history tells us that. If we go back and look at the dot-com boom, we all knew that the internet and technology was going to radically alter business models, society, and the economy at large. We had to wait about a decade for it to actually happen. And AI, being the most contemporary topic, is here now. But I think that we're still rapidly trying to find the use cases for it, and then monetize those use cases. So it could be a little bit further out, is what I'm saying. Meditech, in many respects, these are, having an impact on health takes a relatively long amount of time. And those technologies, though, are coming into society, into the population today, and already having an appreciable effect, I would say. And should we use that as a shameless segue to talk about Ozempic? Because I think that's where I can see in the data quite a big impact.
Yeah, okay. So because you looked at the sort of the impact on the wider economy of, for example, Ozempic. And what is it you're seeing?
Yeah, well, this is I think absolutely fascinating. So if you look at, Ozempic, for those that haven't been following the news, is a miracle weight loss drug. I think that's probably the way I would describe it.
Not that we're advocating it, of course, but yes, that's what people say. Yeah,
absolutely. We certainly don't give investment advice on this call, and we don't give medical advice either.
Definitely not.
But the drug has catapulted its creator, Novo Nordisk, to be one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. Yeah. It is a drug which Morgan Stanley estimates about 7%, that's 24 million Americans, could be on in the next couple of years. And it's got the potential to cut daily calorie consumption by those same individuals by about 30%. Okay. So let's just see, before I get into what I think is the interesting story here, look at how the market reacted. Look at how the CEOs of companies who deliver those calories. So, you've got CEOs of companies like Pepsi, Nestle, Krispy Kreme, the famous donut creator, all coming out saying that they're looking at this as a potential headwind. They're looking to understand the impact it might have on their businesses. They're taking it really seriously, is my point. Because if you're in the business of selling calories, the potential impact of a drug like that, and remember my point about the investments that are happening into these kind of drugs and these kind of technologies, Ozempic is here today. There are more coming down the pipeline every year. If you're in the business of selling calories today, the potential impact of that drug is measurable and potentially huge on your business. And there are obvious targets, and those targets, I've named a few of them, but they're the purveyors of fast food and high calorific foods. And you've had the CEO of Walmart come out and say they've looked at data of people that shop in Walmart. And Walmart's interesting because you can go into Walmart and go to the pharmacy, and then you can go into the supermarket and buy your groceries. And they have cross-referenced the data of people that went to the pharmacy and bought Ozempic and then went into the supermarket and shopped. And they can see a measurable decrease in what they're spending on fast food or on junk food.
That's remarkable.
And I think that is what I think it's potentially huge. I mean, there are now some really interesting questions about, well, what happens to that money they weren't spending on food? Is there a substitution effect? Do they spend it elsewhere? within the store. But just to throw out another stat here, because remember, Ozempic isn't necessarily just about weight loss. It's purported to have impacts on cravings more generally. I looked at some survey data which CNBC did in the US, and they asked people about impulse buys and impulse shopping.
Not just food, but any kind of impulse shopping, like.
Yep.
I was going to say a Birkin bag, which is what we often talk about, but that's not an impulse buy. But yes, sort of shoes, clothes, whatever.
Yeah, and they asked them about the full gamut of impulse purchasing. And what was interesting is that over 70% of impulse buys are focused on one area alone, food.
Right.
Which I think is remarkable. And they, and if you do some calculations, you find that an average American probably spends about $5,500 a year on food, which is just wasted ultimately. It's an impulse purchase. So, this is why these companies are taking Ozempic so seriously, because, that expenditure could be impacted quite materially. And as I said, we don't know yet about where that expenditure could be redirected to. We're still in such an early stage in this journey, and there'll be people out there looking for the flaw in the argument. There'll be people out there saying, "Well, Ozempic could just be another fad. We've been through these diet fads before. Perhaps this is just another one." I lean more to the side that the volume of capital being invested in, directed back at those population statistics, at old populations, at populations with lifestyle illnesses, and the volume of investment happening in R&D is now not just snowballing, but of such a large scale that I think drugs and technology are just going to keep coming down the pipeline. So we should think very differently about what that means for working age populations and the quality of our lifestyle in years to come. Final point, because winners and losers, I've talked a bit about the impact on fast food companies. The impact on the pharmaceutical companies is obviously the opposite. Novo Nordisk, I glossed over the point, is now one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world.
They're bigger than Denmark's GDP, aren't they?
They are bigger than Denmark's GDP. And there's a whole interesting story into the origins of Novo Nordisk in particular, and its its relationship with the Danish economy, which we could cover maybe on another call perhaps. But when you think, I did some Googling, I thought, well, how much does this thing cost? What does it actually cost to buy Ozempic? And what's the consumer choice here? Well, obviously, it's the most expensive place to buy it in the world is in the United States.
Yeah.
Where it's about $950, I think, $930. So that's about, £740. And that's for a month's use.
Okay. So
in the UK, it's a bit cheaper. It's somewhere around £150 to £200 a month. So these are huge, and if you think this is perhaps just we're looking at this through a very narrow optic of weight loss. Other lifestyle related illnesses will have other treatments which are going to have similar cash flows. And if you think that the demand is only going to increase, then this is this $8 to $10 trillion global healthcare industry, I think, is probably about to get a lot bigger in the decades to come.
Yeah. Okay. So just to sum up, then, we're looking at these sort of mega trends, sort of demographic mega trends. On the one hand, we've got a shift in sort of population boom to Africa, away from China and India, and that's obviously going to have an impact on the growth of China and India's economy and potentially on the growth of African economies. Then we're talking about on the sort of, that's the predictable thing, because we know how many people are being born now, and we know how many people we're talking about sort of population in 2050. Then we're talking perhaps about what the population or the workforce within developed economies will look like in 25 years' time. They're going to be older, but they might not be overweight because they might be all on weight loss drugs by then. We don't know. I mean, we've got a couple of sort of market leaders at the moment, but that's going to obviously have a big impact on how productive that aging workforce is in 25 years' time. And then interesting now, which I find fascinating, is your point about how this impacts the wider economy, because it's great, people are craving less, they're making fewer impulse purchases, but that has an impact on the people who produce and sell these things that people are buying on impulse, whether it's donuts or fizzy drinks or whatever it might be. And then I guess also, I mean, there's pluses and minuses, aren't there? Because on the other hand, you've got less waste, which we could all do with wasting a lot less, throwing away a lot less. So that's much better for the planet. And it's also going to be very, very good for pharmaceutical companies as well. Fascinating stuff. All right, then. A reminder that the views expressed in this podcast are not intended to constitute investment advice or dietary advice, as David says, are accurate at the time of recording and are subject to change. Thank you very much, David. And thank you for listening and for your comments, suggestions, fan mail, feedback, but please just don't try and sell us anything.
Yeah.
Keep it coming, very welcome. Keep it coming. Keep it coming. We'll be back next week with more Need to Know. Until then, bye for now.